welcome everyone. I'm glad to see all of you here. Again, my name is Alan Gephardt and I'm one of the rangers at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. So our talk today is about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm going to begin by reading an excerpt from a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to Albert Hodges on April the 4th, 1864. And Albert Hodges was the editor of the Frankfort, Kentucky Commonwealth. I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. And I think that the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, is an example of just how events moved Lincoln, guided him, guided the federal government for the first time to the idea, to the action of freeing the enslaved in the United States. But of course, today, it has been criticized. In modern times, it has been criticized, particularly by Richard Hofstadter, historian of the 1940s and 50s, as a very legalistic document that had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. Also, it is questioned today, did the Emancipation Proclamation free any slaves? For generations, the answer to that question has been yes. But again, that has come into doubt in some circles today. The efficacy of the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's motives have been called into doubt. Did Abraham Lincoln proclaim emancipation as merely a military objective, a way of defeating the Confederacy militarily, or did he have a moral purpose in proclaiming emancipation of the slaves in the United States? It's to be noted that only 10 of the states in rebellion are listed in it, Tennessee being excluded because Tennessee was at that time under complete control of the Union. And of those 10 states who were named in the Emancipation Proclamation, only parts of 2 of those states were governed by it. Parts of Louisiana, which were in control of the Union, parts of Virginia, which were in control of the Union, and of course there was the coming state of West Virginia that was also excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. 4 border states were excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, 4 border states which were also slave states. So there were no slaves freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in Maryland, in Delaware, in Kentucky, in Missouri, in West Virginia, in Tennessee, and in those parts of Virginia and Louisiana which were under control of the Union. One of the books that I relied on in creating this talk today was written by the historian Alan Gephardt, and he begins his discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation by suggesting that Abraham Lincoln was the last of our Enlightenment politicians. Thinking of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which led the founders to create our nation under the Constitution, to write a Declaration of Independence. Those founders, being part of the Enlightenment, were men who followed reason more than passion in their political dealings. And Guelzo claims that associated with the idea of reason as the motivation in politics is the idea of prudence. Prudence being shrewdness, looking at a situation, understanding all the various parts and motivations of people, and being able to judge how best to act under certain circumstances, which leads us to exceptional judgment, prudence being part and parcel with exceptional judgment, and the ability to see the whole situation, not just a part of it. And so Guelzo credits Lincoln with being a very prudent politician, a politician who preferred incremental change to categorical or immediate change. That's not what Lincoln was looking for. And so Lincoln, at the beginning of the war, preferred gradual, compensated emancipation of slaves in the border states. He believed that that was going to help the Union to overcome the rebellion. He believes, Welzo, that this politics of prudence that Lincoln followed explains Lincoln's very cautious approach to emancipation. What else does prudence in this context imply? It implies, and it implied for Lincoln, that slavery must be ended by constitutional means. And that meant that the states themselves had to end slavery within their borders. The federal government constitutionally had no authority to end slavery in the various slave states. The states themselves had to end slavery, and that was what Lincoln wanted to follow, a constitutional, a legal approach to ending slavery. Now, at the same time, Lincoln was living in a time, much like our own, I think, where there's a lot of ethical absolutism. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, many people in the North believed that slavery was a moral wrong, while many people in the South believed that slavery was a moral good. And as we look at this illustration of the Emancipation Proclamation, note the quote by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. He says that slavery will be the cornerstone of this new Confederacy. So Southerners who supported slavery believed that it was a moral good, that it was completely appropriate and right that black people should be enslaved, that it was good for them to be enslaved. And so you have these moral absolutes. Slavery is a moral wrong, slavery is a moral right. Let's take that a bit further. Now, I've already skipped a few slides there. So again, shrewdness, exceptionally good judgment, the ability to take in the whole of the situation, and know almost automatically how to proceed. I'm going to come to this later, but I'll come to it now as well. Something that Abraham Lincoln said in a speech at Peoria on October 16th, 1854. I hate it, slavery, because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites. So for all the people who criticize Lincoln as not taking a moral stand on slavery, he more than once, repeatedly, in the 1850s and 60s, spoke to the idea that slavery was a moral wrong. But again, we have some thoughts here. All men are created equal and have a natural right to control their bodies and their lives. That is the core idea of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal in their right to control their own bodies and their own lives. It is immoral for one man or any group of men to control the lives and bodies of any other man or group of men, human beings. Opposed to that idea, given the chance, blacks are as capable as whites to conduct their lives, to earn their bread by their own labor, to grow just as well as anybody else. So people who are advocating the idea that slavery is wrong are saying, wait a minute, it is the institution of slavery that has held blacks back. You remove that and you will see that black people will be able to do just as well in life, in society, politically, socially, economically, as white people. But then we flip back again to the idea that black people, the black race, is inferior to the white race. Slavery is appropriate for black people. It introduces them to Western civilization, to Christianity. It is where they belong. Slavery is antithetical to the founding idea that all men are created equal and we must end slavery. It is a moral wrong. If we free the slaves, they will murder their masters and their families. There will be bloodshed everywhere. And finally, I would suggest that those who opposed freeing the slaves also feared that once you free the slaves, you are putting black people now on a moral equivalency with white people. And there are a lot of people in the South and in the North who didn't like that idea. So this is the moral, the political, the ethical context of where we are in 1861. And finally, I'm going to just mention one more comment that was made by a Delaware Unionist in 1861. We look upon slavery as a curse, but we look upon freedom possessed by a Negro as a greater curse. How can you make white and black people equal? A lot of people questioned that in 1861, 62, and so forth. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that events controlled Abraham Lincoln, so he said. So one of the first events that I want to talk about is the passage of the first Confiscation Act, which was passed on August 6, 1861. It allowed for the confiscation of Southern property used in the Confederate war effort, including black slaves. Now, Lincoln signed that law into being, but he actually had many doubts about it because he thought that it might not pass constitutional muster. Again, black slaves were the property of slave owners in the southern states. Once the war was over, potentially, people could be taken to court to get their slaves back. So he thought that this might not pass constitutional muster. That was a concern. He also recognized that the idea of confiscation in international law implied that there are two nations at war with one another. Lincoln did not want to recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy as a nation at war with the United States. He did everything he could to ignore that fact, to never speak to the idea that a Confederate nation was legitimate in the first place. These are states that are in rebellion. This is not a separate nation at war with the United States. Therefore, confiscation, internationally speaking, is a problem. He doesn't want France and England to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. And so he has a doubt about that as well. The border states, the politicians in the border states, opposed this idea of confiscation. They saw it as a backdoor emancipation of their slaves, of their property. And while there are border state slaveholders who remain loyal to the Union, that too could be called into question. If you push too much, those border states may join the Confederacy. What happens when Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri are now part of the Confederacy? Think about, and I think this is easy geographically to imagine. Washington, D.C. is right in the middle of Maryland and Virginia. Suddenly it's surrounded if those border states were to join the Confederacy. And so this Confiscation Act is a bit problematic, but Lincoln signed it nonetheless. Now, this concern about the border states is front and center with Abraham Lincoln throughout the first years of the Civil War. And because of that concern, he rescinded or revoked or disagreed with various actions by military commanders and one of his own cabinet officers. So in May of 1861, General Benjamin Butler designated slaves who crossed into Union lines as contrabands of war. In August of 1861, General Charles Fremont proclaimed emancipation of the slaves in Missouri. In January of 1862, his own Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, proposed to arm slaves who crossed into Union lines. And then in April of 1862, General David Hunter declared martial law in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, again freeing the slaves. And in every case, Lincoln said no. And again, his primary considerations are one, these may not pass constitutional muster. He's very aware that the Supreme Court under Roger Taney has supported the institution of slavery in the states. Two, these men do not have the authority to do what they're doing. And he reserved to himself the authority to act on slavery as he chose at the proper time and in the proper place as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. And again, we come to an example of the response of politicians in the border states after the passage of the first Confiscation Act. His own very good friend, Joshua Speed, a fellow Kentuckian, argued that Fremont's action was a foolish proclamation that will crush out every vestige of Union support in the state of Kentucky. So these actions were very much a concern of Abraham Lincoln. They would not help the Union cause, they would hurt the Union cause. But again, I think it is important to remind ourselves that Lincoln did oppose slavery, and he stated this on many, many occasions. Again, that speech at Peoria, and I'm going to come back to another quote from the letter to Albert Hodges in 1864, in which he said simply, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." But Lincoln's primary goal at the beginning of the war was to preserve the Union. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, the 1860 election was an election in which one party, if one group of citizens lost, another won, and the losers refused to accept the fact that Lincoln and the Republican Party won the election, and therefore they were willing to remove themselves from the country and risk war. And Lincoln thought of that, if that continues, then it will just break down. Anytime some group within the body politic disagrees with the result of an election, they withdraw themselves, then you have no constitutional government. You have no nation based on the idea that all men are created equal. Elections must be accepted by the winners and the losers alike. That's part of his thought process. He believed that the American Union was the best form of government yet to be created in the world, that it provided everyone in this country with an opportunity to live out their lives equally with all fellow citizens, to prosper to have their views in some way, shape, or form reflected in the body politic. So for these reasons, Lincoln is against these actions by these military commanders, by his Secretary of War, and so he rescinded their actions. He turned to the idea of gradual, compensated emancipation by the border states as a way to end the rebellion. He had long thought that gradual, compensated emancipation would be the key to ending slavery in this country. And he included with that proposal the idea of voluntary colonization of the now freed slaves. He believed that this was a constitutionally safe idea. The border states free their slaves because the Constitution recognizes that slavery was a domestic institution of each state. It was supported by the Constitution, and therefore the states themselves had to end slavery. The federal government, the legislative branch, Congress, the president, the executive, could not do that constitutionally. The states had that power. And so he was trying to persuade the border states to adopt gradual, compensated emancipation. And when I say gradual, he looked to the idea that it could take as long as 30 years or more to eventually eradicate slavery from the South. When you look at the northern states after the founding of the Constitution, the acceptance of the Constitution, many states, all the northern states, were slave states initially. And they passed, over time, laws that allowed for the gradual elimination of slavery within their borders. So it took decades to eliminate slavery from Pennsylvania, from Massachusetts, from New York, so forth and so on. That's the model. And Lincoln sees that as something that's very plausible in the southern states. Again, this is a prudent approach to ending the rebellion and removing slavery from the United States. In Lincoln's mind, emancipation in the border states was the key to defeating the rebellion. It would weaken the states in rebellion in the Confederacy to see the border states remaining loyal to the United States and at the same time ending slavery. And he began with the state of Delaware. By early 1862, Lincoln was focused on introducing gradual compensated emancipation in Delaware. Delaware had the smallest population of slaves in the Union at that time, roughly 1,800. If I can get this plan started in Delaware, I have no fear but that all the other border states will accept it. And so he turned to Delaware's lone congressman, George Fisher. And Fisher got a bill introduced into the Delaware legislature that promised compensation of up to $900,000 from the federal government to encourage slave owners in Delaware to free their slaves. That's $20,000 per slave. And think of that in 1862 dollars. That's a lot of money. The Delaware House accepted that, passed that legislation. The Delaware Senate did not. So here they are being offered $20,000 per slave, and still slaveholders in Delaware in the legislature said no. So there's a lot of opposition to this idea of compensated gradual emancipation. Still, Lincoln was undaunted, and he presented this idea to Congress on March 6, 1862. The idea that the United States cooperate with any state, border state or state in rebellion, to compensate slaveholders to free their slaves. Congress refused to act. Northern Democrats said that the border abolition would lead to Negroes migrating to the North, competing for jobs with whites, demanding equality with whites, and that was unthinkable to a lot of Northern Democrats. There were suggestions in Congress that emancipation would lead to the desertion of soldiers in the Union Army. They're not fighting to liberate slaves. They're fighting to preserve the Union. So this is a very controversial idea. In fact, New Jersey Representative Nehemiah Perry stated very frankly that Northerners did not want to pay to liberate blacks. They would not pay money to liberate blacks. So this idea of compensated gradual emancipation is going nowhere in Congress. Yet I also found it very interesting. The Daily National Republican of Washington newspaper noted, quote, "For the first time in 2 generations, we have a recommendation from the presidential chair for the abolition of slavery and of measures in Congress to invite and assist it." So this National Republican newspaper in Washington recognized that here we have with Lincoln a sea change in federal policy. For the first time, a president is saying, we need to free the slaves. But again, Lincoln's efforts in this behalf were fruitless. Still, Union victories in 1861 and 1862 in Kentucky, at Fort Donelson, and Fort Henry, in New Orleans, strengthened Union sentiment in the border states. Lincoln tried again to appeal to Congress to support gradual compensated emancipation in the border states, but again it went nowhere. And he even proposed, as a sweetener if you will, voluntary colonization of black people out of the United States to Africa, to the Cherokee district of what is now Panama. Didn't make any difference. There was no support in Congress for this. But again, back to my original thought that events led Lincoln to the Emancipation Proclamation. 1862. Congress was moving ever so slowly in the direction of emancipation when, for example, the Washington, D.C. Emancipation Bill proposed by Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts passed in April of 1862, freeing the slaves and compensating their owners, and money was provided for colonization. Congress was also moving in the direction, in 1862, of using confiscated slaves in support of the military. Again, Senator Wilson of Massachusetts introduced a bill to conscript persons of African descent in the construction of entrenchments and other services for the United States Army and Navy. And despite opposition to the idea of elevating black people, the bill passed. As you all probably know, by the summer of 1862, it is very much in doubt where this war is going and who is going to win. Everybody thought at the beginning of the war that it was going to be a 90-day affair. It turned out to be an extremely bloody affair that had no end in sight. And so now, by summer of 1862, there are lots of people in Congress who are saying we've got to take some actions to try to end this war, and these are some of the actions they take. And they recognize that at the heart of this war is the issue of slavery. And so we have that D.C. Emancipation Bill. Congress had always had control over what happened in the District of Columbia. It had no control, constitutionally, over what happened in the border states or in the southern states. Right? July 17th, 1862, the Second Confiscation Act was passed. It allowed for the confiscation of rebel property regardless of whether it was used in the Confederate war effort or not. That bill also prohibited the return of slaves to their owners by Union officers, and this is something that had been happening in 1861 and early 1862. There were many Union officers, generals, who were returning slaves to their owners, slaves who had crossed into Union lines. And this bill, too, provided money for colonization. Not to say that it was used, but the money was provided for. Then there's something else that happens in 1862 that is gradually leading Lincoln to change his approach from trying to persuade the border states to free their slaves themselves to using his war powers as commander-in-chief to declare the slaves free. And that's the transition. We're going from trying to persuade the border states to free their slaves, to show the other southern states that they're on the losing side of this war, to using his war powers to declare military necessity to weaken the South, end the war, free the slaves. Under his war powers, he can do this. That's constitutional. But proposing legislation to federally end slavery is not something he can do. Well, July 8th, 1862, he meets with General McClellan at Harrison's Landing. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, General McClellan was a Democrat who was opposed to the idea that this war was being fought in part to free the slaves. He said, "I am fighting to preserve the Union and the power of the government, no other question." That's McClellan early in the war. And he maintained that stance right through 1862. And at that meeting at Harrison's Landing, he gave Lincoln a letter which stated that emphatically: do not make this war a war to free the slaves. So Lincoln is seeing that the war is dragging on, that it is a much more bloody affair than anyone anticipated. He can't get an intransigent Congress to go along with him on the idea of compensated emancipation. He can't get the border states to adopt compensated emancipation to free the slaves, to weaken the Confederacy. And he's got Democratic generals or generals who oppose fighting this war for any other reason than preserving the Union. And at that point, he begins to change his mind. He says, I've got to do something different. And he began discussing doing something different on July 13th, riding in a carriage with Secretary of State William Seward and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. They were on their way to the funeral of the infant son of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Lincoln had decided that it was a military necessity, absolutely essential to the salvation of the Union, that we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. And he invoked his war powers under the Constitution as the way to achieve that goal. He began writing his emancipation order on the 17th of July, and he presented it to his cabinet, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, on July 22nd. Again, he claimed his authority to do this as part of his war powers as commander-in-chief. Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, the most anti-slavery member of the cabinet, was opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation on the grounds that it would create bloodshed in the South and it might be seen as a desperate act by France and England, who would then intervene in the war, perhaps on the Confederacy's, or to the Confederacy's benefit. The Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair, feared that blacks would flood the North. The Attorney General, Edward Bates, approved of the Emancipation Proclamation, but he also wanted it tied to colonization of blacks, get them out of the country. Secretary of State William Seward also supported the Emancipation Proclamation, but with this caveat, as many of you may know. He said to Lincoln, "If you do this now, it may appear as a desperate act of a losing cause. Wait until we have a victory and then declare emancipation." And Lincoln took that advice. Now again, modern critics will say, Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any of the slaves. But keep this in mind in terms of the border states. The border states were not at war with the United States, and therefore Lincoln could not invoke his war powers to free slaves in the border states, or in Louisiana, parts of Virginia. Could not invoke his war powers because those places were not at war with the United States. So that answers the criticism, I think, that Lincoln was doing this for some illegitimate reason, that it really didn't free any slaves, et cetera, et cetera. He couldn't free those slaves, not constitutionally. Without the war powers as his defense, Lincoln continued to fear that any attempt on his part to free the slaves would be overturned by the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice Taney. August 20th, 1862, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, issued his Prayer of 20 Millions, in which he urged Lincoln to turn the war into a crusade to free the slaves. Lincoln responded 2 days later, and he said, in effect, if I can free all of the slaves and preserve the Union, I will do that. If I can preserve none of the slaves and preserve the Union, I will do that. If I can free some of the slaves, but not all of the slaves, to preserve the Union, I will do that. He's dropping a hint right there, because he understands that, yes, that Emancipation Proclamation that he is proposing is going to apply to some parts of the country, to some slaves, but not to others. And that's what he chose to do, because, again, constitutionally, he could do it. He said to Greeley, after making that statement, some, none, all, I have here stated my purpose according to my official duty. And I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. So again, to Lincoln's detractors who say that he really was not interested in freeing the slaves, I think that statement confounds the criticism. He is determined to do what he can as a public man within the law and the Constitution to free the slaves, which is his personal desire. He believes that this idea that one group of men can own and control the lives of another group of men, human beings, is immoral, and it is antithetical to our nation's founding. Well, the victory that he was looking for, that Seward suggested, of course, came on September 17th at Antietam. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough of a victory that Lincoln felt comfortable that he could issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which he did on September 22nd. And in that proclamation, he is essentially issuing an ultimatum to the South. Either end the rebellion or forfeit your slaves. What's the reaction? Of course, in the anti-slavery world, lots of praise for Lincoln for finally taking this step, for making this war not just a war about union, but a war, a crusade to end this abomination of slavery in our democratic republic. Those who were pro-slavery, again, spoke to the idea that there would be bloodshed in the South, that there would be army desertions. The London Times made a very familiar criticism. Where he has no power, Mr. Lincoln will set the Negroes free. Where he retains power, he will consider them as slaves. What's one of the results? In the 1862 elections, the Republicans lost 31 seats in the House of Representatives. They retained control of the House and the Senate, but they lost seats in Congress. Interestingly to me, here in Ohio, the Democrats captured 15 of the 19 seats. One of the 4 Republicans who was elected that year was James A. Garfield. First time, first election. McClellan, as a result of his inability, his failure to follow up on Antietam, to pursue Lee's army, lost credibility within that army. And now that the election was over and the winds were blowing against McClellan, Lincoln could get rid of McClellan, and that's what he did. He fired him. In his annual message in December of 1862, Lincoln again offered compensated emancipation with colonization. Didn't go anywhere. And again, he's concerned about avoiding a federal court case against the Emancipation Proclamation. But he had issued his preliminary emancipation again on September 22nd, saying within 100 days, if you do not end the rebellion, you will forfeit your slaves. And Lincoln was determined that he would issue the final proclamation on January 1st, 1863. It would go into effect on January 12th of that year. There was a concern about that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued in September, and it was this. It stated that the federal government, Lincoln stated that the federal government would recognize and maintain the freedom of the emancipated and would do nothing to repress the emancipated in their efforts to maintain their freedom. In other words, there's an implication there that the federal government, that Lincoln would not stand in the way if there was bloodshed in the South committed by blacks on whites. That was the implication. On January 1st, that was adjusted. And Lincoln urged those who would be emancipated to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And again, the criticism that the Emancipation Proclamation, as finally issued on January 1st, 1863, was no more morally eloquent than a bill of lading. Lincoln concluded the Emancipation Proclamation issued on January 1st with these words: "Upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." In the weeks that followed, the artist Francis Carpenter began sketching Lincoln's image for the portrait that he would eventually create of the signing of the preliminary emancipation, with Lincoln surrounded by his cabinet. And Lincoln at that time said to Francis Carpenter that the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation was the most significant act of his presidency. As affairs have turned, it is the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century. So what were the results of the Emancipation Proclamation? Did it free any of the slaves? Slaves began running away in the states in rebellion and in the border states as Union forces came within their territory. So, yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the South, in the states that were in rebellion. They ran off the plantations. They got behind Union lines. The Emancipation Proclamation did free slaves in the South. It also resulted in the recruitment of black males into the army, and that was done to further destabilize the South. My God, those slaves are now fighting against us. They've got arms. It increased the respect of white soldiers for black men who fought alongside them to subdue the rebellion. And it resulted in the push, eventually, to grant voting rights to black veterans, at least. But Lincoln remained concerned that the Emancipation Proclamation could face a court challenge before or after the war ended. So he ultimately got behind the idea that a constitutional amendment was the logical next step. A constitutional amendment to end slavery would be passed by the states. And that would end that domestic institution within the states. That was the final solution to ending slavery constitutionally and legally. And so the 13th Amendment ultimately ended slavery in this country. Events made it possible for Lincoln to transform the Civil War from a war only to save the Union to a war also to end slavery in this country. The historian Harry Jaffa, I think, put it very well. He said, there was an indissoluble unity in Lincoln's three permanent and unchanging goals: preserving the right of free elections, preserving the Union, and placing slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. These three ends were distinguishable in Lincoln's mind only as different aspects of one sovereign purpose, represented by the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the key principle being all men are created equal. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there we go.